Welcome to a forensic historical investigation into the deep shadows of antiquity. Today, we're stepping back into the terrifying, visceral reality of the ancient world to examine one of the most famous and, frankly, unimaginable martyrdoms in human history. We're investigating the story of St. Lawrence. It's a narrative that's been deeply etched into our collective consciousness for nearly 2 millennia, right? A tale of absolute defiance in the face of agonizing pain. But as we strip away the layers of centuries in this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves a fundamental question. How much of this iconic, brutal story is actual, documented history, and how much is the product of brilliant, deliberate myth-making? Our objective today is to entirely separate the fiery legend from the cold, unyielding truth of the Roman state.
To really grasp the magnitude of this event, we need to completely immerse ourselves in the year 250 AD. I want you to imagine the dense, suffocating atmosphere of 3rd century Rome. The cobblestone streets are just steeped in political paranoia. The air is thick with the terrifying weight of absolute imperial law, a place where a single whisper of dissent could literally mean sudden death. On one side, you've got the most dominant, highly militarized empire on Earth, desperately struggling to maintain its psychological grip over a deeply fractured populace. And on the other side, a rapidly growing, incredibly defying Christian faith that absolutely refuses to bow down to the emperor. Out of this brutal, high-stakes clash emerges a sensory nightmare that has haunted Western civilization ever since. I'm talking about the extreme heat of glowing coals, the sickening scent of burning flesh, and the terrifying imagery of a giant iron gridiron, forged specifically as an instrument of state-sponsored terror.
Section 1. The Gridiron and Famous Legend.
So here is the story exactly as it's been handed down to us through the centuries, captured with just incredible visual power. The legend states that Lawrence, a defiant archdeacon, was sentenced to a horrific, highly theatrical death for refusing to surrender the hidden wealth of the early church. His decreed punishment? To be roasted alive. If you take a close look at the classical paintings and stained glass masterpieces that immortalize this moment, you're going to notice a very deliberate artistic choice. Painters consistently used deep, heavy, contrasting shadows, pressing right up against illuminating, violent orange flames. They didn't paint the gridiron as just some slab of iron. They painted it as a glowing altar of divine victory. In these brushstrokes, you aren't witnessing a man dying. You're seeing an incredible, almost superhuman bravery, standing tall against the absolute cruelty of the Roman Empire. The gridiron completely transcends its purpose as a torture device and becomes the ultimate eternal symbol of a fiery trial.
And right in the crucible of this unimaginable agony, Lawrence is said to have looked up at his executioners, smiled, and delivered this: "Turn me over, I am done on this side." I mean, it stands as perhaps the most famous, darkly humorous one-liner in religious history. But if you look beneath that dark humor, you'll find some profound psychological warfare. You see, in the Roman mindset, physical dominance and the infliction of pain were absolute. Fear was literally the foundational currency of their authority. By laughing through that excruciating pain, Lawrence was effectively shattering the psychological weapon of the empire. By openly mocking his own execution, he was completely stripping Rome of its power to instill terror, declaring loud and clear that their ultimate punishment meant absolutely nothing to him.
Section 2. Legal Face of Valerian's Edict.
Now, we have to pivot sharply from the searing heat of this gridiron myth straight into the incredibly cold geopolitical reality of 258 AD. Emperor Valerian was not some madman acting out of random theatrical cruelty. Not at all. The Roman Empire was actually drowning in a state of severe existential crisis. They were facing massive external threats at their borders and a devastating internal economic collapse. So Valerian's legal mandates were a calculated, weaponized use of Roman law. Sure, he scapegoated the growing Christian population, but his primary motivation was strictly fiscal. To solve his sweeping economic crisis, he legally mandated the immediate confiscation of all Christian wealth for the imperial treasury. And to enforce this, the edict ordered the systematic execution of the church's leadership, bishops, priests, and deacons. This wasn't merely religious persecution, guys. This was a highly sophisticated legal strategy designed to completely decapitate the organizational and financial structure of a rival social system.
And that context brings us directly to the doorstep of Lawrence. Why was he, out of everyone, specifically targeted by the full, crushing force of the state? Well, Lawrence was one of the 7 deacons of Rome, serving directly under Pope Sixtus II, But crucially, his specific role was the archdeacon. That essentially made him the church's treasurer. He managed a vast, underground network of material goods, real estate, and the distribution of alms. So, when Roman military forces captured and swiftly executed the Pope, the Roman prefect immediately turned his sights directly on Lawrence. The prefect was under immense pressure from the emperor to secure this massive hoard of wealth to bail out the failing imperial economy. The state had absolutely zero interest in Lawrence's theology. They wanted the gold, and they demanded he surrender the so-called treasures of the church immediately.
Section 3. Social rebellion against authority.
What Lawrence decides to do next is not merely an act of simple charity. It is a highly deliberate, profoundly subversive political strike. Let's follow this tense 72-hour timeline. On day 1, Lawrence is handed an official imperial decree: gather all the gold and silver of the church and turn it over to the state. He asks for, and surprisingly is granted, exactly 3 days. On day 2, instead of complying, he initiates what can only be described as a high-stakes heist executed in reverse. Operating right under the noses of the Roman military, he works feverishly in absolute secrecy to liquidate absolutely every single asset the church owns. He distributes every coin to the destitutes of Rome, intentionally and permanently emptying the vaults the emperor so desperately needs. The tension reaches an absolute boiling point on day 3. Lawrence returns to the imperial authorities, but he doesn't bring chests of gold. Instead, he brings a massive sprawling crowd of the city's blind, crippled, orphaned, and widowed citizens, marching them straight into the halls of the Roman prefect.
Standing there before the highest, most powerful officials of Rome, with the absolute poorest of the poor gathered right behind him, Lawrence points to the crowd and declares, "Behold, these are the true treasures of the church." Just imagine the heavy, suffocating silence that must have fallen over that room. The sheer audacity of the gesture was staggering. The prefect, who is fully expecting endless riches to save his own political career, was struck with absolute shock, which was followed rapidly by an uncontrollable, visceral rage. It was a complete, highly public humiliation of the imperial state.
Lawrence had to die, but not because of a religious disagreement. He had to die because he committed a blatant act of social subversion. To really understand the gravity of this, we have to look at the Roman socio-legal system. In Rome, the poor, the sick, and the crippled had absolutely zero legal or social worth. None. By presenting them to the state as treasure, Lawrence was legally committing treason against the foundational values of Rome. He took the empire's entire value system, where wealth, violence, and power dictated human worth, and he violently flipped it upside down, mocking their authority right to their faces. Helping the poor in this context was an undeniable rebellion. And this ultimate disrespect toward the highest Roman authorities is exactly what sealed his fatal decree. The sentence was instantaneous.
Section 4. True History. Execution by Sword.
Now, here is where the famous legend and the actual forensic historical truth violently diverge. Let's compare these two realities side by side. On the one hand, we have the golden legend, a slow, agonizing death on a roasting gridiron, a highly specialized, incredibly theatrical method of torture designed just for Lawrence. But on the other hand, we have the historical reality agreed upon by modern scholars: swift decapitation by the cold steel of a Roman sword. Why? Because Rome was an empire built on paperwork, logistics, and terrifying efficiency. The Roman bureaucratic machine demanded strict compliance with standard operating procedures. The idea of building a custom gridiron, procuring all that fuel, and staging a slow execution, it was an utter waste of state resources and time. The heat of the gridiron makes for an incredible, immortal story for sure, but the cold, highly efficient reality of the Roman sword is what actually happened.
And the forensic consensus and historical documentation back this up absolutely unconditionally. Valerian's edict of 258 AD was explicitly clear in its legal text. Christian leaders were to be executed by decapitation. Roman authorities were famously rigid. They rarely, if ever, deviated from an imperial decree to just invent custom torture devices on the spot. Furthermore, the historical record proves that Pope Sixtus II and the other deacons caught in this exact same political purge were all beheaded. The documentation leaves zero room for doubt. It is historically impossible that Lawrence, swept up in the identical legal mandate, was treated any differently.
Section 5. The Power of Myth and Hagiography.
So that begs the obvious question. If he was killed by the cold steel of a sword, where on earth did the roaring fire come from? To answer that, we have to look into the deep psychological trauma of the early Christian community. We need to talk about hagiography. A hagiography is a narrative of a martyr, but here's the catch.
It was never intended to be an objective historical record. These stories were specifically engineered as powerful theological propaganda. Following years of brutal, unyielding persecution, the early church was deeply, deeply traumatized. They needed way more than just a memory. They needed an essential survival tool. Hagiography acted as a psychological defense mechanism. They didn't need a historically accurate account of a swift bureaucratic beheading. They needed an invincible superhero. They needed a narrative of supernatural endurance to give the faithful the sheer courage required to face their own impending executions.
The actual mechanics of how this myth was constructed are just fascinating. First off, there's the narrative brilliance of it. A sudden strike from a sword is tragic, but it's over in a fraction of a second. It offers zero theatrical triumph. A slow fire, however, that perfectly symbolized a protracted ultimate trial of faith against the flames of adversity. But historians point to something even more granular, something almost unbelievable: simple linguistic transcription errors. Early Latin texts documenting Lawrence's death contain the phrase passus esse est, which simply translates to "he suffered." But over decades and generations of monks copying these manuscripts by hand in dimly lit rooms, a single letter was lost. Passus esse est was mistranscribed as assus esse est, which translates to "he was roasted." Literally, one single missing letter changed the entire course of history. Combine that with the fact that there was a conflation with the true accounts of the Phrygian martyrs from a different era who actually were burned alive, and you get the perfect storm. Over time, the strict historical facts blurred away, but the powerful emotional truth of the legend totally crystallized.
Which brings us to a final, pretty profound question. Even when we are presented with the forensic evidence and the cold historical facts, why does humanity still prefer the eternal legend of the fire over the truth of the sword? Look, the historical Lawrence died an incredibly brave death, standing face-to-face with a tyrannical, militarized empire to protect the absolute most vulnerable people in his society. That is fact. But the mythical Lawrence, the man cracking jokes on a glowing gridiron, he transcended history to become something much, much larger. He became an eternal symbol of defiance. Perhaps it's because regardless of the era, the empire, or the century, humanity possesses a deep, fundamental need for defiant heroes. We inherently crave heroes who have the unyielding courage to look directly into the searing flames of injustice and smile. Thank you so much for joining me for this documentary analysis. Until next time, keep questioning the history handed down to you.